Okay, today I have the great pleasure of getting a chance to talk to someone that was recommended to me by a friend. He's somebody I've known from the Max world for a long time, but he's got a real wide range of interests and people that he's influencing as well. His name's Trond Lossius, or Lossius. What would be the best way for me to say that?
I'm fine with it either way.
Okay.
Either way.
All right.
In Norwegian, I would say Trond Lossius, but I tweak it myself when I speak English because it sounds strange as well.
Right. Okay. So I'm going to call you Trond for the rest of the way, and we'll go with that. But with that, I say hi to you. How are you today?
I'm fine, thanks.
Thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to have a chat with us. What I'd like to do is kind of kick off by having you talk a little bit about your work. What are the things that you're currently really into?
I have a background as a composer. I was educated as a composer, and then I got involved with working with sound installations, which meant that there was like a shift in where I worked from like the music community much more towards like the fine art community, and I find that sort of like working between those two practices or those two fields or those two discourses, I found to be very interesting. So that's kind of like where I still am, like 15 at least years later. I really enjoy working in collaboration with other artists and projects that are multimedia, where I mostly work on sound, but combine it with video or paintings or sculpture. Sometimes there might be theater projects. But I really enjoy working in these cross-disciplinary settings.
Right. That's actually interesting, and I want to dive into that a little bit more later on, because the idea of working in collaborations is something that I really enjoy a lot. I find it really kind of helps me get a vision for a specific project. But before we go there, I want to ask you about a couple of specific things that you work on. First of all, you are most known to me as a member of the Max community, but also as a member of the GymOMA development group. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right.
Can you explain for the listeners a little bit what GymOMA is?
Yeah, I think I'll do that by going back to why I started being involved with it in the first place. And that was back in 2002, when I was working with a contemporary theatre company in Norway that's called Verdensteatret. They performed international quite a bit. And we were working on a production where we wanted to do a lot of sound processing on the voices of the actors. So artistically speaking, the idea was that rather than thinking in a very traditional film way, in terms of different layers of sound, where you might have like diegetic background sound and you might have music, and then you have the voices of the actors. We wanted to blur all of that and maybe be able to create the sonic backgrounds and the whole sonic world that the actors lived within by processing their voices. So for most of that production, the voices would be like completely abstract. You couldn't understand what they were saying, but it was much more about like a certain aesthetic sensation of sound and how those sounds evolved from the actors. So obviously we used Max extensively for this. We met a lot of challenges in the production because the production was that big that we needed to be more than one person working on all of these patches and controlling the logics of them, both in rehearsals, development, and in performance. And we struggled with things like how do you control your Max patches as they grow really large? Right. Because here it's not just that there's lots of things going on, but 5 minutes later there might be a lot of other things going on. And this way all through the production. So it became like a lot of logics of logistics of how you control these kind of systems, when you have like a performance that is lasting for an hour, and also being more than one. I mean, I guess we all inherited Max patches from someone else, and I think most of the time it's not a pleasant experience. we all seem to have our own, very strange way of working on patches.
Well, and everyone else's way is wrong also. So
not necessarily. Yeah, it might be that mine is too, but we all find our own particular wrongs, I think.
Right.
So anyway, I mean, I saw the challenges both in terms of how do you control large max patches, and also how do you manage to kind of come up with some conventions that make it easier, at least, to collaborate. And then I started looking around for solutions, or if someone else were addressing similar problems. And one of the things that struck me as relevant was the work that Tim Place was doing on Jade back then.
Right.
So I checked that out, and I was thinking that probably the way it was currently, it wouldn't necessarily work for us, but he certainly had a number of approaches, a number of ideas that would be very interesting to learn more about. So I organized a workshop here in Norway in 2003. And we were able to invite him over for it, which was brilliant. And what was even better was that, after workshop, he came over to Bergen, and we spent a number of more days, discussing and brainstorming between the two of us. And I think he had already been thinking of open sourcing parts of Jade. So I said that if he did that, I would be very interested in contributing towards it. So that's what became GymOMA. But it's like, the initial motivation for the GymOMA system for me was to find a structured way of addressing the kind of challenges you meet when you work with really large max projects, and you're beyond the simple prototyping. You don't just like small prototyping or small projects towards much larger productions, and to find a structured approach towards that. And I think that still remains very much, one of the core problems or challenges that GymOMA try to help you solve.
Right. Well, it's actually it's a very pointed thing you talk about, because in a way, there's value to having Max not provide a lot of infrastructure. But on the other hand, it also, with that freedom comes a lot of potential problems when you're trying to, especially as you point out, when you're trying to coordinate among a bunch of users, among a bunch of people all attempting to solve a problem together.
Yeah, it is. And I think it's great that Max starts out with just an empty patch. Because I think at the end of the day, the thing I've loved the most about Max has always been that it's not a program that is pushing me in particular directions, which are the directions that this program wants to push everyone in. I find it a very free, liberating program. And there's lots of other like music software, which will quickly invite you to create a certain kind of music, and if you don't want to do that, you have to be aware of it and kind of like fight it a bit. But I think with Max, it's such liberating things, and I think I've seen patches that are a complete mess, and they are all the better for that. But just like speaking for myself and the project I've been working on, sometimes we've needed to have very structured approaches to it, and not least because Max is as extendable as it is with SDK and so on. It has been possible for us to do that, and I think that's great.
Indeed. So now the other thing that I know of you doing in relationship to music and music technology and art technology is working in a lot of what I would call massive speaker arrays or surround systems with large number of speakers, and particularly working with ambisonics type systems. Could you tell me a little bit about that? And again, I'm kind of needing you to help provide some definition for listeners who might not be familiar with what ambisonics is or what other surround systems you might be exploring.
Yeah, sure. Again, I think I will start out with, what was the motivation for getting into this, which happened very accidentally. I think, by the end of my composition studies, I was very influenced by, for instance, Eric Satie, John Cage, Brian Eno, particularly Brian Eno, and the minimalist music. So I liked things that were moving really slowly, or, even better if it's not moving at all. And rather than focusing on the relationships between notes, which I think has been one of the big discourses of classical music, over maybe the last 1,000 years, which notes should stand next to each other.
Right.
I just wanted to enter inside one note and stretch it out. So when I started working with these installations, I was thinking that, maybe if I used more than 2 speakers so that they were surrounding you and you were physically stepping inside the sound, maybe that would also help you mentally to step inside the sound in terms of how you're listening to it. So that was like the motivation why I the first time used 4 speakers. Mm-hmm. And then I was like really amazed of the difference between the stereo and the 4 channels, and like all of the expressive and emotional potential that it started revealing. So it just became a field that I was deeply fascinated by and just wanted to continue exploring. Well, I think, in a way, and I often think of what I'm doing as a kind of sculptural practice, but I'm working on an invisible, untouchable sculptural medium, which is sound. But it's really about how the sound exists in and surround you in the space. Is one of the things that's fascinated me deeply.
Sure.
So I mean, this first project that I'm referring to, I think happened back in 2001. And I didn't know much about spatialization, and there weren't that much techniques available in Max. I mean, all of these kind of objects that you know and use now, like the VBAP that Ville Pulkki made, or the ambisonic externals that was first made by Asti in Zurich, and then others have been making similar things later on. All of that kind of like appeared little by little. So whenever I got my hands on a new spatialization technique, I was very curious about, trying to understand both the theory of it, the assumptions of it, and then explore how I might artistically use it. And very often, I mean, I've been kind of like doing things that are, completely wrong in terms of the, what you're supposed to do.
Right.
Which, using it in ways that it was not intended for at all, but that still produce very interesting spatial results in the space. So this has just been, again, ongoing exploration, because I think, one of the things that triggers me creatively is to work on something that I didn't know. I don't know it fully from beforehand, so I'm kind of like discovering for the first time myself in the process of making it work. I think that often helps me working with it in an intuitive way that I find, brings interesting results. While if I work on things that I know deeply, I don't know what to do with them any longer. So I have to find something else I don't know and explore.
Sure.
So these kind of like explorations have just been ongoing and are still ongoing. I mean, I still find things that I don't know. And I think in particular in the last 5 years or 6 years, I've been very interested in doing field recordings using a microphone that is ambisonic. And ambisonic is basically just a way of storing multi-channel files in such a way that you don't have to decide when you record exactly what your speaker layout is going to be like.
Right.
You can kind of like decode or interpret it with different speaker setups later on, which means that you can use less or more speakers, you can position them differently, and you can get a system that is working quite well. So there's a flexibility in it. And it's also that this microphone, it's doing like 4-channel recordings. So I can use that on a portable recorder and actually, carry it around and do recordings in the surroundings. And I find these recordings very interesting to do, because it's not just a matter of recording some sound, but for me now it's very much about recording places and listening into places, and then working with the idea of place later on.
Interesting. I'm really curious. You obviously are well versed in technology and technological concepts, but you have this background where you're a studied composer, and but you also have this tremendous curiosity. I mean, quite frankly, an awful lot of people, the second that they find something that's interesting to them, that's the last learning that they kind of ever do. And so it's always encouraging and exciting to me to hear from people who talk about, really having a life of questing, right? And you definitely are that. Can you tell me a little bit about your background, your growing up, and what it was like growing up, and what led to you being the kind of artist that you are?
Wow. to the extent that I know.
Yeah, right. To the extent that you can figure it out, right.
So, I mean, I grew up, in a suburb outside Bergen, which is, a pretty small town by international standard, but it's the second biggest one in Norway. Part of a very big family. I have 6 siblings. So I guess, being in the middle of the 7 of us, I really felt the need to find some spaces where I could withdraw and recover from the noise of the family.
Sure.
So as I think, very often, I would just sit by the window and watch cars pass by, or, go out and just sit on a rock in the forest and just sit there for an hour and just observe the leaves moving, or, whatever. And I guess that's the kind of experience that I was, again, discovering and recognizing when I first got to know the ambient music of Brian Eno. Which was very different from the kind of pop music and rock music that you otherwise would be exposed to mostly as a teenager. And from him, I went on to discover other kinds of musicians, with this similar tendency of listening to something for an extended while. So in terms of education, I have a very mixed background, because I first studied natural science. So I have a master thesis in geophysics, which was oceanography. But my master thesis was itself quite cross-disciplinary. It could just as easily fit in information science or in mathematics, I think,
Sure.
as in geophysics.
Right.
And then I made this abrupt shift to composition, because, the dream for me was to work with music. And for a long time, I didn't know how to do it and where to start, how to get going. But then I was very lucky to meet a number of people that had a belief in me and supported my development in different ways, so that it became possible to start studying composition. And at the time I was thinking that, okay, so that was one study lost. But by the end of the composition studies, when I discovered Max, it was suddenly these two things came together. And of course that was really attractive to me, because it was suddenly able to pull on a lot of things that I had, but had not used for a number of years.
Right.
And then later on, because of this interest in the cross-disciplinarity between music and the fine arts, I did a artistic research fellowship at the Art Academy in Bergen.
Okay.
Which is a similar thing to a PhD, although I don't have the formal degree.
Right.
So that's a very mixed background.
Yeah, indeed. It is a mixed background. Now, I'm curious, to what extent, you talk about the work that you did in geophysics as being sort of also mathematical and statistical and technological.
Yeah.
But also earlier you kind of mentioned that one of the things that you're sort of into is these recordings of places. And I'm wondering to what extent those studies in geophysics had or have some effect on how you choose places to record, or what it is you're listening when you get to a place. I have a friend who was a biologist before he got into art and composition, and a lot of his work is related to species going extinct and stuff, and his biology background definitely informs his artistic work a lot. What do you see, other than the technology comfort, do you see much cross work between those areas?
I have to think, because I've never thought of it that way before. I guess, because of part of my geophysics studies, I was also studying meteorology. So I think observing the weather, and we have a lot of weather in Bergen, mostly of the rainy kind. But I think definitely that's something I'm very aware of. And also I think that the weather is, when you're thinking of places around here, it's impossible to think of them without including, weather as something that is making a deep impression in terms of, where the place is.
Sure, and what it feels like, right?
Yeah, but I think apart from that, I mean, most of the field recordings I do are really just like recordings from very mundane suburbs. I think in that respect, maybe that goes back a bit to, in particular, the very first years of my life, when we were living next to, we were living in like a new suburb area in Bergen that was built more or less at this time when the city grew from being like of the old kind of city with, houses for the industrial workers very close to the town, to suddenly be organized in a completely different way because, everyone started to get cars and could travel for longer distances, and the city could grow outwards.
Right.
So there's kind of like quiet neighborhood thing, which probably happened later in Norway than in the United States. And, even if I was just a few years old, then it's like my very first memory is just sitting in the window and looking at the cars that is passing behind another building. And in one way, I feel that, that's the recording I'm doing now again and again and again.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, I'm curious about how it is that you got into composition and kind of rather late in your studies. I mean, were you like in music classes and stuff when you were a child?
Yeah, I was. I started playing mandolin when I was 7 years,
okay,
which is the instrument that I'm the best at. And we'd had a mandolin hanging on the wall because my mother wanted to learn the instrument when she was young, and then it was just hanging on the wall. But it was very beautiful, with this, decoration on the body of it.
Right.
So I was very intrigued by that instrument. And I think, I just, for as long as I remember, I just always knew that I was going to play the mandolin at some point. So as I started taking mandolin lessons when I was 7, and I also started playing piano. And later on, I was playing in a brass band for a while. And then in my teens, I was playing in a punk band for a short while, which is, I think there were two things I learned from that. One is that's where I started, creating music myself. And the other thing was also that, it don't need to be, even if a lot of the things I do now are technically complicated, in one way, I think, my works always, at least to myself, end up feeling very simple, very minimalist in a way. And
right.
Where the technology part of it is also quite hidden for the audience. It's not, I don't feel any need to show off what I'm doing technologically speaking to the audience. It's really, they are just means, very important means for me, but means towards getting to the kind of expression and the kind of situation that I want to invite the audience into.
Right. Well, it's interesting that the punk thing would have had that kind of influence on you, because it was very influential to me as well.
Yeah.
And for me, it was that the thing that I learned from doing and working on punk music was this sense that there are no rules, So prior to that, I had studied like song form, and I had studied, a lot of things, and I'd always tried to move work into, within the parameters of those rules. And then I started working with punks. I was a recording engineer at the time. I started working with punks, and really quickly it was sort of like, there are no rules, try everything. And that was really liberating to me, But yeah. I find it interesting that one of the people that was influential to you was Brian Eno, because in addition to doing really interesting work, he talks about his work, and he's introspective about his work in a way that a lot of musicians aren't. And I'm wondering, to what extent were you influenced by his writing and his speaking as much as his recordings?
A lot. I think I've read everything I could come across that he's ever, any interview that I've come across. I think his thinking has influenced me in two ways. One is that I'm influenced by a lot, or have and have considered a lot of his ideas. And I think what's so lovely about his ideas is that in a similar way to John Cage, they're not like the ideas that explain his music and then it's done. They're kind of like, they are places to take off from and go in many other directions. They're opening up a lot of things, way more than he's able to explore in his own lifetime. So they're kind of like, they are inviting a lot of creativity, I think. So that's one thing. But I think the other thing that I've taken away from him is also the value and the importance of not just doing stuff, but also continuously reflecting on what you're doing and trying to use your intellectual capacity as yet another talent that might you push further towards where you dream of going, or where you sense that it might be interesting and possible to go.
Right. Yeah, it's almost like he describes paths instead of giving answers a lot of times, which is pretty wonderful. Of all of Eno's work, what is the thing that influenced you the most?
That's got to be like the second track on the first ambient record, Music for Airports. And I think that is, again, there's several things about it. It's one thing is that it's such a clear example of the idea of the ambient listening. But the second thing is also that it's based on very simple principles. It's just a number of tape loops with one voice singing one note and then silence before it repeats. But because the pitch is different between the voices and all the loops are different lengths, you get like this tapestry where the different threads are combining in other new patterns.
Right.
And I think that when I started with Max, I think, the point where I realized that this was probably the program that I would be working a lot on for the rest of my life was very early on, when I was going through the tutorials in a very systematical way. And at some point, I think, I made a very simple patch with a toggle, a metro object, and then a button. And then I just started the toggle and just saw this one blink. And then I copied all of it next to it and just changed the number of the metro. And when you do that like 5-7 times, you basically have the compositional structure of that piece by him.
Right.
And I think, that fascinated me for a number of reasons. One of them is that it helped me. It kind of like was the first time I saw a problem to the thing that was like my biggest problem, or like a really deep crisis as a composition student. And that was that whenever I saw a timeline, I didn't know what to do with it. I was, which came down to my mentality. It was like I felt like a lot of these compositional approaches, which are about like development of material, really is like, it's not where you are that's important. It's how you're moving somewhere else. But for me, if I found a place that I found very interesting, I just wanted to stay there. But the timeline is always encouraging a narrative, a move forward. It's always somewhere else that is the goal and that really matters than the place where you are right now. And with this very simple max patch, I just saw a very different way of approaching it that was not like the horizontal along the timeline, but just looking at it from above and thinking of distribution as time as something that has to do with density, rather than with like this narrative, this story, this plan.
Well, that's actually really interesting, because you hit on something. I'd never thought of it that way, but that is actually one of the things that I find really intimidating about working on like recording music for myself. That when there's something about the second that it becomes laid out on a timeline, it's almost like a new level of stress comes along. And I've always kind of tried to figure out, what is it that I find stressful or disturbing about that? I think you hit on something, which is that the timeline focuses on moving to the next place rather than embracing the one you have. It's why I've always preferred performance to recording, because in performance there's no timeline, or at least I don't have one.
Well, I mean, it's clear that there's lots of composers that manage to work with the timeline, while not sticking with the narrative. I mean,
right.
For me being, fairly new to composition, that was like the problem I was facing at the time. And but I still think that it's like, between this linear narrative form and this focus on state and timbre, they are two very different mindsets.
Right.
And I think, I'm very much geared for the second one.
Right. One of the things you talked about was in your move from, in your studies, moving into composition, you talk about people that were supportive and were helpful in that move. And I'm always curious about the people that influence us or the people that help us move in the directions that we, maybe we were meant to head. Can you tell me a little bit about those people and how they actually influenced your move into composition?
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky to meet many people, over the years that have been functioning like that. But it's like, I was not necessarily encouraged, to do to move career-wise in the direction that I have from home. I mean, I was very good at math and stuff like that at school. So I think my parents, saw me, moving towards a kind of like academic career of some kind, in maths or something. But I was really, really deeply involved, kind of like, music meant a lot to me. And I was also very introvert as a young person, had difficulties doing the kind of conversations we are doing now, for instance.
Sure.
There were a lot of things that I was carrying that I was very, had difficulties expressing to anyone else. But it's like the music was for me a different kind of language, a non-verbal language, where when I listened to what others did, the music of others, it resonated and, got to places in me that nothing else could get to. And the same when I was doing music myself, I was also feeling that I was expressing part of myself that, that I didn't have any other channel for at the time. So my dream was to work on music. I mean, that was definitely like a dream, but it was also very much, for some reason, something I thought of as a utopian dream.
Oh, right.
But I was very fortunate that at some point, with the mandolin, I was taking up lessons after not having taken lessons in the teens, and I was starting taking lessons from a viola player in the local symphony orchestra here in Bergen, and he was like really kind. I was coming home to him for several hours once a week, and we would be playing. And he would be tutoring, like a really long, giving me a really long lessons, and then we would have a long lunch, and then we would continue. And he never charged for it, which I think was just like remarkably generous to do. And he was a really good musician, and also someone who took music deeply seriously. So I learned a lot from him on many layers, anything from technique to how you think about music. And I also had another friend, a folk musician from New Zealand that lived in Bergen, repaired instruments, and that I got to know when I bought a new mandolin. And then he invited me home to him in the weekend, to play with him. And I ended up, getting to his place and staying there every weekend, for several years. And we would just be sitting, several musicians in the ring for 6-7 hours a day and just play and play and play and play pubs. And I mean, that was an adventure for me, and of course something, that gave me like an opportunity to really develop.
Right.
And then at the same time, I also started reading music theory, because I really I was thinking that you probably can't take a music education as a mandolin player, but I was very interested in the composition of music. So I started reading theory, and then got accepted into the conservatory as a composer. But I think those people in particular, the two of them, I wouldn't be where I were today, if it wasn't for them. They were really crucial, at the time where I decided to go from the natural science to music.
Going from there, as you become a more accomplished composer and musician and performer, you talk about how you do a lot of work in collaboration with people. And this is something that resonates with me. I find that I'm able to complete work more readily when I'm working with someone and collaborating with someone. And but in your case, you've done collaborations with visualists, visual artists, with with people doing more traditional fine arts work and stuff like that, but you're also doing collaboration on like the GymOMA project and stuff like this. Tell me a little bit about why you choose to focus a lot on collaborations and what it is that you get from them that's important to you.
I think I just enjoy it so much. It's but it's also, I was living in Namibia for 2 years, came along with my wife, and we were living in a very small fishing village. Very few spoke English, and I didn't work myself there, so it was very difficult for me to get into the community. So I was basically living in, for 2 years, speaking to very few but my wife and my then 2-year-old kids. And I just realized, that was too lonely for me. So like being an artist and working alone at the studio day after day simply won't work for me. I would only get depressed, I think. But it's like when I work with someone else, I find, that it's just both, from just like, as a human being, I enjoy it a lot. And I really enjoy the sense of being able to mean something to someone else and help them realize what they are doing and seeing what they're doing, getting to know what they're doing and getting a deep understanding of it. And also being able to bounce ideas and materials back and forth, the whole social play of it. And I think, maybe that this idea that composers should be like this one-person genius, and the same goes for fine artists. But I think anyone that has played in band know that if you play in a band, that really is a group thing, and working as a group is a very natural thing to do.
Right.
And I think most other settings also you work with a group of other people, looking at how most monkeys behave. They are living in groups; they're not living alone. So I think this is really deeply ingrained in our nature as the kind of animal we are. We want to belong to a group. So one of the things I enjoy, for instance, from the GymOMA development is that the bouncing of ideas, because I might have my ideas and my way of thinking that how I should do it. But then, in particular, in the first years of the GymOMA development, whenever someone new came on board the project, they would sort of review and criticize the project in a way where we had to redesign everything. Mm-hmm. But it was such an interesting process every time, and it got way better that way. It took us 10 years, to finally say that, okay, we will call this a 1.0 release.
Right. Right.
But it's, apart from, producing a piece of software, some Max library that has been very useful to myself. It's also been such a pleasure, interesting and nice journey as well. Both like the intellectual challenge and stimulation you get from the other developer, which I think, they are all really, really talented and brilliant people. And it's also, a very strong friendship between us, I think. And we've been lucky to meet every now and then, most often in Albi in France, where, which is a really beautiful place with fantastic food and fantastic wine. So like the development has not just been a question of, solving some problem, but it's been much, much more than that. Mm-hmm. And I enjoyed it enormously. Interesting.
Now, you kind of talked before about having been kind of a shy person, but you don't seem all that shy anymore. No. You're involved in a lot of interaction with a lot of people.
Yeah.
How did you break out of the shyness?
That's a long story, and it involved a therapist.
I see. Okay.
Yeah, but I think I got to a point. I got to a point, where I saw that I had to do something about myself. So one of the things is that in Norway, you have to do military service, but if you are like a pacifist, you can do a civil service instead. So I did that, and okay. I thought that some of the people that I'm able to be or was able to be around at the time were kids. So I worked in a kindergarten, and I think that was one of several things that really helped me. And I had some years where I was spending most of the day just sitting at the cafe discussing the meaning of life, mm-hmm. which is something I still enjoy doing.
Well, awesome. Well, boy, we've already kind of burned through the time. I can't believe that we spun through that. I want to jump to the GymOMA thing a little bit more. One of the things that I notice is that the GymOMA project, it seems to require sort of like a commitment to enter it. I think that it's an opinionated system. It sort of like has a way that you need to approach it. And when people do, they seem to really embrace it and do well with it. What are the means how do you think is the best way for people who'd like to get into GymOMA to do that?
I think we're not by far been as good at documenting it as we should have been, and it's like one of the things I really had hoped that I would have had the time to do already is to make a series of screencasts that might make it easier to access, to learn how it's working. I hope I get the time to do that later this spring, but I just see the calendar filling up. Yeah. But I think for the time being, if anyone's interested in checking it out, don't hesitate mailing us. And we do have, if you go to the website, there's a mailing list for users, with a link at the bottom of the website. Signing up for that and asking for help is probably one way of doing it, because I think either you need to attend some kind of workshop where we would be presenting it, and I would be more than happy to do that kind of workshops, if someone would like to invite for that anywhere. But eventually, I really hope that we get the time to document the system a bit better than we have so far. Because I think if you're going to start it, don't do it 2 weeks before the final deadline. Do it at some point where I have a bit of time in between two projects and where you can explore it and test it out, and don't have to use it immediately, and maybe not even have to decide whether you're going to use it or not immediately, but to let it sink in for a while and then think of it. And I think, for some projects it might be really useful, and there are other projects that are small enough that I don't really need it myself for them. So I don't always use it myself. It depends on the project.
Sure. Well, Trond, this has been a fantastic opportunity to talk and get caught up with you and learn a little bit about your background. As one final question, one of the things I like to ask people is to provide some advice. If you were to run into the 18-year-old version of yourself, and you were going to provide some suggestions or information and advice, what do you think, what would that advice be?
I think probably, I would spend, rather than just coming up with like a very short advice, I think probably what I would try to do if it was someone I sensed, that they have potential, would be to spend a bit of time with them to try to understand where they are and try to help seeing some of their potential, and then suggest for them to pursue some of that, and more than anything encourage them. I think when you're young you need encouragement. I think most of us are probably in different ways insecure, even if we don't admit it to anyone else, we're insecure, and I find that insecurity, that's one of the worst things that can happen in terms of creativity. It's like when you don't think too critically, you don't think too much that it's really great what you're doing, and you don't think that it's really bad what you're doing, and you don't think that you're really talented, and you don't think that you're not able to work with this at all, but you're just engaged with what you do. I think that's where you are, doing the interesting stuff. So encouragement, I think, is the one thing I would try to push.
Well, Trond, thank you so much. That's very inspiring words. Thanks so much for spending the time talking to us. And I hope we get a chance to meet again soon and to talk a little more.
Yeah, same here.
All right.
Thanks to you as well.
All right, thank you. Goodbye. Okay, many thanks again to Trond for his time and for spending time chatting with us. If you haven't checked out the GymOMA project, please do. It's available in the Package Manager and Macs. Otherwise, you can go over to gymoma.org and check out the work that they're doing. With that, I want to thank you, the listeners, for keeping on tuning in. For all the people I've met recently that said that they've been listening, I really appreciate it, especially those of you who ran into me at the the Denver Boulder Synth Meetup. That was really cool to check in with a bunch of listeners. So thank you so much, and I'm signing off. I'll catch you next week. Bye.